For this step, we're going to be putting together the feather board side of the electronics. This step is going to take two parts. First, we'll be stacking the feather boards, and then second, we'll be hooking up the wires to the feather board units. For the first part, you're going to need your feather boards, stacking headers, vise, soldering iron, and a soldering wire. And then for your second part, hooking up the wires, you'll need your wires, a wire cutter and stripper. You'll need what's called Dean's plug, along with shrinking wrap and a heat gun. I'm gonna set this over here while we do this first step. So for the first step, what you're gonna be doing is you're gonna be stacking one of the feather boards on top of the other. So one feather board has your microcomputer, microcontroller, plug-ins, and your SD card slot. The other feather board has the real-time clock and the real-time clock coin cell battery slot. So this one, which has the real-time clock and the coin cell battery slot, will be on top of the other feather board. And the way you'll stack them is using these stacking headers. So you have male and female stacking headers. You have one group that's shorter and one group that's longer. So what you want to do is you'll want to go ahead and place those together. You have, like I said, male or female and then male. And on the male, you'll see the pins on one side, they're shorter, on one side, they're longer. So the side that's longer is going to go into the female stacking headers. That way, it's one unit and you have short pins on both sides. And you'll do the same with the longer group. And once they're together, you'll be placing them and soldering them to the feather boards. So you have a long and a short one, which corresponds to the pins on your feather boards. You can see on one side there's more pins and on the other side there's less. So your longer set of stacking headers will go on the side that has more pins. And the side that has less pins will have the stacking headers that are shorter. Once you place them into one of the feather boards, you can go ahead and place the other feather board on top. And this is the same way. You have one side has more pins than the other. The side that has more pins will be with the stacking headers that are longer. And they will be going right on top. So now it is one complete unit. And all you have to do is solder it together. So the way you'll do this is you'll place your bottom feather board into the vice grip. This will hold the stacking headers on top of that bottom feather board, and then the other feather board will be on top of those stacking pins sitting there. Then you want to solder the pins on the top feather board. You'll need to do every single pin. You'll run up one side and down the other. It's important to just take your time, and you want to angle your soldering iron so that it doesn't hit and melt the different pieces that are on this feather board. Now, once you've soldered the pins on both sides of the top feather board, this feather board is now connected to the stacking headers. You want to flip it over, and you need to solder the bottom feather board to the stacking headers as well. So you flip it over and hook that new bottom feather board to the vice grip, and you'll need to solder up and down both sides.
To make us who we are, and sometimes impressions just get in the way of your heart.
now that you soldered both tops and bottoms feather boards to the stacking headers, it is one unit. It's a lot more sturdy than when you started out. So that's it for that part of this step. Okay, for the second part of this step, we're going to be attaching wires to our feather board units. So for this, you'll need wire cutters and wire strippers to cut and strip your wires. You'll need your feather board units that you have soldered together and stacked. You'll need Dean's plug, shrink wrap, you'll need your vice grip, you'll need your soldering iron, and you'll need your heat gun. I'm gonna set the heat gun over here because that is the last step. So, for this step, you're going to need to pull apart your stacked feather boards. Now, it's important to know you have to find the best way for yourself to pull it apart. It's different for everybody. I found that if I pull it apart this way, I have a tendency to bend these stacking headers here, making it more difficult to put them back together. And if you bend them too much, you could break the pins and you'll have to replace them. So I found that if I wiggle back and forth from the ends, they'll slide out much easier without bending. So it's just find the best way for yourself, like for you, of how to pull those apart. So what we're going to do is we're going to attach these wires to the top feather board. That is the feather board that has the coin cell battery slot. And what we're going to do is you need to find out which of these pins you need to connect the wires. We have 4 wires. They're going to connect to the GND pin, the 3V pin, the SDA pin, and the SCL pin. So how do you know which wires are which? So if you look on this feather board that has your SD card slot, you'll notice that the pins that you have the stacking headers in have letters and numbers next to them. They're a little covered up, so you can flip the board upside down and you can see the letters clearly. So you can find your 3V pin, your GND pin, which is important to note that there are 2 GND pins. We're going to be using the GND pin that is closest to the 3V pin. So it's kind of hard to see which side. You could have it flipped up down, but there's only one 3V pin. And if you're looking at the feather board so that 3V is pointing in the direction that you can read it, the GND pin that we're going to use is just 2 slots below. And then we're going to be connecting our SDA pin and our SCL pin as well. So if you have your feather board stacked, the stacking headers connect this pin of this feather board to this pin of this feather board. It connects the currents. So if you're trying to connect a wire to your SDA pin, you'll follow the stacking header up and it's going to be the same pin here that is here. Now at this top feather board where you're going to attach your wires, you'll see an outer row of pins. That's where our stacking headers are in, and there's an inner row of pins. The inner row is going to be where you're going to attach your wires. Now, your inside pin slots, that's going to correspond. It's going to be the same as the directly adjacent pins. So this pin right here, this inside pin is going to connect to the pin right next to it. So if you look at your letters down here, I'm looking for my 3V pin. I'll follow that header up and then just go directly to the right. Or follow it straight up and go directly to the left, depending on which way you're holding it. So we're going to be connecting to the wires to this feather board here. I will place my feather board into my vise. That way it is secure and I'm ready to attach the wires. And I found it's nice to have this other feather board here facing the same direction. That way I can, if I get confused about which pin I'm supposed to be putting in, I can look back and see. What you want to do is you'll want to go ahead and strip one side of your wires. I've already done that using our stripper. These wires do not need to be incredibly long. You can make them longer if you want to, so you can leave room for you to mess up when you're trying to solder, and you can cut it off and keep going. But if you make them too long, it's gonna be a little more difficult to fit everything inside of the PVC pipe. So I typically make it just long enough to solder and then run out of the feather boards unit and connect to the Dean's plug. Another thing to note, we're going to be soldering our wires underneath of this board. You can solder them from the top, but to save room, we usually solder from underneath. That way when the boards are put together, the wires are sandwiched in the middle and they can run out. It saves room instead of having them on top and then you kind of have to push them down. It's just a nice personal touch to what we do. So I'm ready to solder my wires to my feather board. I'm going to pre-strip one end of the wire. I'm going to find the wires that I need in the pins that they're going to go to. We use our black wire for our GND pin. We use the red wire for the 3V pin. We use the white wire for our SDA and yellow wire for our SCL. So I'll start with, I typically start with my red wire because I know 3V is going to be the easiest to find. So I know that my 3V pin is here, so I'm going to go to the pin that corresponds to that. Like I said, we're going to be running from the bottom up. I will slide my wire through. And solder it to the board. So now my red wire is attached to the 3V pin. Next, I'll do my black wire, like I said, that goes to our GND pin, grounding pin. And also remember that there are 2 GND pins. We're doing the one that's closest to our 3V pin. If you look at it, it's just one skip. You skip one pin and it's one pin down. So I'll go ahead and attach my black wire. And I'll solder that to the board. Next, we'll do our SDA pins and our SCL pin and wires. These are right next to each other, so it's nice. You just have to make sure you attach the correct wire to the correct pin. I'll be attaching my white wire to my SDA and my yellow wire to my SCL. I will do whichever order you find best. The yellow wire, which goes to our SCL pin, is on the inside, so I like to do that first, just so it leaves room to come in and solder that last pin on the outside edge. So I will solder my yellow wire to my SCL. And finally, I'll solder my white wire to my SDA. Now I have all 4 wires attached to the correct pin. Next step, I will braid these wires so that they fit nice and snug when I want to sandwich the board together. So I'm going to go ahead and braid. Braiding is basically just twisting. You'll twist together the 2 wires. You'll twist together your SDA wire and SCL wire together because they're right next to each other. And then I will twist together my red 3V wire and my black GND grounding wire. Next, I will twist together my two groups of wires that I've just done. I will want to run the wires out the opposite way of the SD card slot. Same way, you'll want to run them out the same way as the coin cell battery side. That's just the easiest way that we found. That way you can have access to your SD card without having wires in the way. So I will kind of press them down and I will spin them together. Now they're all in one nice bundle and I can put together my stacking headers again. And once they're down, now we have a nice little unit with my wires soldered to the feather board. Now we're going to be attaching our soldered wire to our Dean's plug. The reason we're going to do this is so that we have our wires that connect here. We'll attach to our Dean's plug, and then the wires that come from our pressure sensor will attach to the other side of the Dean's plug, and we'll have one nice connection between the pressure sensor and our feather board. So there are a few key things that I like to do when I'm attaching wires to Dean's plugs. One, I like to know which side I'm attaching it to. There's a male side and a female side of the Dean's plug. The reason I like to know which side I'm attaching to is I like all of my feather board sides to be attached to my male side and all of my pressure sensor wires to be attached to my female side. That way, if this gives out, I can replace it with another one. And if this gives out, I can replace it with another one without having to change the Dean's plugs, because I know that the connection will be the same. Another thing to note is the order that the wires are attached. The black wire has to be at a specific pin. If you notice, if you look at the Dean's plug, there are 4 pins for the 4 wires, and one pin has a larger gap from the rest of the 3. So there's a big gap from one, a large gap than the rest of the 3. So your black wire has to be with that singular pin. The other 3 can be whichever order, but we like to keep them all the same. That way, again, if one side gives out, I know that I can connect another one and the wires can be exactly the same, and I can do it without having to replace the Dean's plugs. So when you're soldering wires to your Dean's plugs, you have to pre-tin. And when you're soldering wires, you need to keep your Dean's plugs plugged together. That way, when heat is applied to the Dean's plug, if the pins happen to shift, I know that even when they are cooled down, sturdy, they will still be able to connect and disconnect. We'll need to pre-tin wires and pins on the Dean's plug. Pre-tinning is just adding some soldering wire to the material. So I will put the wires in my vice grip. These wires have been stripped. You need to strip the wires a little bit, and then you'll add some soldering wire. Solder to these wires. It's okay if there's excess solder on them. That is good, because it's going to make a connection with your Dean's plug even easier. So once I've soldered these wires, I want to make sure that I have, either before soldering them or after, I've put these shrink wraps onto the wires of that I'm going to solder to my Dean's plug. Now, Dean's plug comes in this package. In it is the plug and 8 shrink wraps. So I like to attach my Dean's plugs to the Arduino feather boards in this step. That way I know that they're there, and then I'll attach the pressure sensor wires at a later step. So you'll need to keep 4 of your shrink wraps separated in a safe place until you're ready to attach your pressure sensor wires. Otherwise you might lose them and not have them. We only need 4 for this step, for these 4 wires. What you'll do is you'll go ahead and pre-tin the Dean's plug pins. That is the same thing as what you did with your wires. You're just adding some solder material to these pins.
You don't hold back from the things that you know. I can feel it.
And then we're going to be attaching our wires to our pins. So like I said, black has to be on that individual pin at the top. And then I'll go down, I'll do black, then I'll do red, white, and yellow. And I want to make sure they're all the same. Make sure you have your shrink wraps on there. And you need to make sure you push your shrink wraps a good bit down, otherwise the heat from the soldering iron will cause them to shrink. And that way you won't be able to slide them up over the connections and shrink them where they need to be. So I'm soldering my wires. All you have to do is, if you place enough solder material on both your wires and your pins of your Dean's plug, is you'll just place your wire, add heat. The heat will melt the solder material, and your wire will fall right in place next to the pin. When heat's removed, it'll cool down, leaving a good connection between your wire and your Dean's plug.
Where it goes.
once all of your wires have been attached, you need to inspect them and make sure there are no accidental connections from pin to pin that would cause any problems. They all need to be individual, no connections. Then you'll slide your heat shrink wraps up over the connections you just made.
You could leave a light by your doorstep. Leave it there for me. So when I wander down your road,
And once your shrink wraps are in place, you just add heat from a heat gun.
see that light, and I'll know you're there. And it's thinking about me.
And now you have a complete featherboard unit with wires and a Dean's plug attached. And that's it for this step.
Have to ask me if I mind anymore.
For this step, we're going to be wiring our pressure sensor. Parts you need for this step are your pressure sensor, your wires, soldering iron, vise, soldering wire, a wire cutter, and a wire stripper. Now, I've already pre-cut and pre-stripped these wires, so I'm going to set these out of the way. There are two important things to note when you're going through this step. One is the length of these wires. So this is a partially constructed wave gauge. You have the pressure sensor right here. Your pressure sensor is going to sit like this inside of the PVC pipe, like this. And your wires are going to run out the bottom and run through the PVC pipe and out the other end. Now you need to make sure that your wires will reach from this end all the way outside of this end, because they're going to be connected to a Dean's plug. And if that Dean's plug is inside the PVC pipe, because the wires are too short, you won't be able to reach it when you need to plug it in or unplug it. So you can use the PVC pipes to measure how long your wire needs to be and make sure that it's going to reach from your pressure sensor and out the other end. Second thing to note is you can see that we have 4 separate color wires. That is because we use 4 pins on our pressure board, and this is a pressure sensor board. Straight out of the package, you can see the pins on one side, and there are letters next to those pins to tell you what those pins do. And those letters and specific pins have corresponding pins on one of the feather boards. So we're going to hook up our wires here to our pressure sensor. These wires will be connected to something called a Dean's plug that I mentioned earlier. And then we'll have wires connecting our Dean's plug to the pins on the feather board. So you need to make sure that the color wire you use to hook up the GND pin, for example, is the same color wire that you're going to hook up to the GND pin on your feather board. So we use our black wire for our GND pin. We use our red wire for our 3.3 or 3 volt pin. We use our white wire for our SDA pin and our yellow wire for the SCL pin. So those 4 color wires will be connected here, and the same 4 color wires are going to be connected to the corresponding pins on the feather board. For this step though, we're just going to be hooking up our wires to our pressure sensor. So I went ahead and already did it, but you'll need to strip your wires. Just strip one end, and it needs to be enough so that your wires can go through the pins of your board. Your wires are going to come up from the bottom of the pressure sensor. That way, when your pressure sensor is set in the PVC pipe, your pressure sensor will be facing outwards and your wires can come out the bottom and run through the PVC pipe. So, as I mentioned, we'll have black, red, white, and yellow. Our black will be set to the GND pin, red will be set to the 3 volt pin, our white will be set to the SDA pin, and yellow for the SCL pin. So what you'll do is you will hook up and place your pressure sensor in a vise, and you'll run those wires underneath. And once you've run them underneath, you will solder them to the pressure sensor board. Once you're done hooking up your wires, it will look like this. And that's it for this step. So you have your wires hooked up to your pressure sensor, and your pressure sensor will be able to set in your PVC pipe, and the wires will be able to run out through the PVC pipe and out the other end. And that's it for this step. For this step, we are going to be setting our pressure sensor inside of our PVC housing. To do that, the parts you're going to need is your pressure sensor with your wires attached. You'll need your epoxy putty, wire clippers, and your PVC housing pieces. The pieces that you'll need, and I've already set them up, are the 1.5 inch PVC cap that is flat, and you'll need a section of your 1.25 inch PVC pipe. I've already cut this, and we usually cut it to about 1.25 inch. And what you want to do after cutting it is you want to sand the top and the bottom of the PVC pipe, making sure that it's nice and flat, and you also want to sand the top of the PVC cap. Then you can glue them together using your PVC cement. What you want to do is you want to make it as central as possible, make sure it's nice in the middle of that cap, and let it harden. It doesn't take long to harden. And after it is hardened, then you may drill a small hole in the center of that PVC pipe and the center of the PVC cap. You want to make the hole big enough so that the wires are able to fit through and go out the other side, but you don't want to make it too large, otherwise you'll have to use excess PVC putty to cover up that hole before we put the clear epoxy in the next step. So first, what you want to do is you want to use your wire cutters to trim down the contact points that you created when you soldered the wires to the to the pressure sensor board. You want to make sure that these contact points are below the pressure sensor circular object on the pressure sensor board. The reason for this is we will be putting some clear epoxy covering the entire board except for that white part, and if any of these contacts are higher, then you won't be able to cover them without ruining your pressure sensor. So you want to trim them down using wire cutters, and once they're flat underneath that pressure sensor, you know they're good to go. The next step will be to run your wires through the PVC cap. Now, once you run all the wires through, you may go ahead and pull from the bottom, get that pressure sensor inside of the PVC pipe. Let's see how it's going to sit. Now you want to make sure that your pressure sensor is able to sit flat, and see how low that you can get it. The lower you can get, the less clear epoxy that you'll have to use in the next step, and you want to make sure that it is flat. That way you're able to apply the clear epoxy on top of the pressure sensor, covering everything. If it is not even, it's a little harder to cover. Then you'll want to, once you've gotten about where it's going to sit, you can go ahead and push the pressure sensor back out a little bit. The next step will be to apply the epoxy putty. You want to follow the instructions. It comes in this packaging, and the instructions are in there. You want to follow those instructions. They'll tell you how to apply the epoxy putty. You just need a little bit, and what you're going to do is you'll knead it. Following the instructions, making sure it gets an even color and it's warmed up. That's when it's ready to be applied. Now, once it's all one single color, it's warmed up, it's ready to be applied, you're going to be applying the epoxy putty in two parts. You're going to be putting one piece underneath the pressure sensor that goes between the pressure sensor and the top of the cap, and you're going to be placing one piece underneath the pressure sensor. I usually use a small piece for underneath the pressure sensor and a larger piece for underneath the cap. So I'm going to place one piece here. I'm going to place it underneath that pressure sensor. You're going to want to move efficiently when applying the epoxy putty. If you take too long, it will harden and you won't be able to put your pressure sensor in place. But if you move too fast, you're going to make a mistake. So move efficiently. Once you've applied the epoxy putty, you may pull down and pull the pressure sensor into place. Now, like I said before, you're going to want to make sure that that pressure sensor is nice and flat. You want to make sure that the epoxy putty is going to hold it in place. You can spin the pressure sensor using the wires, push down your epoxy putty against the cap. But the most important thing is that that pressure sensor is flat. Next step is you're going to be applying the rest of the epoxy putty on the underside of the cap. You want to place it up against where the wires come out and knead it around, making sure that epoxy putty gets all intermingled between the wires, covers up the hole, makes a nice seal so that when you apply the clear epoxy putty, it will not run out of the hole that you drilled for the wires. You want to push it up against the pipe, up against the cap, and making sure that it is creating a nice seal. Once you've done that, you want to make sure you flip it over, make sure that PVC, the pressure sensor is flat still. You'll move it around when you're working with the wires down here, and you might not realize it. You want to flip it over and make sure that it is still flat up top. And you want to continue working with it while the epoxy putty is drying. Once it's hardened, the pressure sensor will be in place and it's not going to move, but if it moves between the time that you're working with it and it dries, then that could create an issue. Once you believe that it is hard enough, it is not going to move, the pressure sensor is set in place, you can set it aside. It'll dry in usually about 15 minutes and it will set hard and you can work with it after an hour. So I'll set this aside for an hour and then continue on with the next step. But as for the step of putting the pressure sensor inside the PVC, that is how you do it. And that's the end of the step. This step will be applying the clear epoxy to the housing unit where the pressure sensor is stored. To do that, you need your clear epoxy, an applicator gun, and an applicator nozzle. You want to follow the instructions that are on the clear epoxy for how to attach the applicator gun and the applicator nozzle and what you need to do to get it ready for application. Once you've attached everything and you're ready to apply, you're going to slowly apply epoxy all around the pressure sensor and on top. You want to make sure that you're covering all the contact points, specifically the metal contact points where the wires are attached to the board. What you don't want to do is get any epoxy on the white circle. So you will apply the epoxy. I am able to move quicker because I've done quite a few of these, but you will want to do it slowly, making sure that you don't make any mistakes and you don't apply too much so that it's going to spill over into that white circle. You're wanting to apply all around, making sure the epoxy comes up and over that pressure sensor board. You want to make sure that your PVC housing is as flat as possible. You're not able to just set it on a table because of the wires that come out from the bottom. So what I have found is if I take a cardboard box and I cut a hole in it, then I can place the wires through there and the PVC housing can sit flat. Once I've added what I think is enough epoxy, I can use a toothpick to push the epoxy around and settle it where I need it to settle. I typically bring the epoxy, you can move it pretty easily, and then it's going to settle flat over time, but I can get it to where I want it to be for the most part. And I'm moving the epoxy up against this white circle on the outside. You don't want it to come up, like I said, over the edge and into the white. If you do that, it will ruin the pressure sensor. So I'll move the epoxy around. If I need to, add a little bit more. And make sure it is all sealed up. I want to make sure this entire board and all the metal contact points except for the metal that is surrounding this white sensor that can be exposed, but every other part of the board and wire connections need to be covered by the epoxy. Now, if these wire connections are too tall, it can be difficult to cover them on the first application. So you can apply the epoxy, let it dry, then come back and add a second layer. The instructions say to how long you need to let it dry. Typically, I'll let it dry for half a day or a whole day. I will set my epoxy and then come back the next day and either add a second layer or continue my work of building the gauge. Once you have set your epoxy where you think it's going to be good and ready to dry, just set the caps aside and let them dry for the day. For this step, you're just going to be adding an extra layer of epoxy to the pressure sensor. This might not be necessary as long as you have all your metal contact points covered, then it should be good. But if you do have some of these contact points poking out creating a bump in that epoxy, it's probably best to just add an extra layer and make sure that they're completely covered. If water reaches those, then they will be ruined. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna follow the same instructions that we did before. When adding the epoxy, you're just gonna add a small amount. You're just creating a small layer on top of the first layer of epoxy, making sure, once again, to not get any in that white circle pressure sensor that's going to ruin it. You're just gonna add a small amount, go slow, and then again, you'll use a toothpick or something that you can push around that epoxy so you can let it know where you want it to go. Just gonna create a nice layer. And making sure you completely cover those metal contact points. This layer should do it, and once you have completely covered those points, should be all set, and you're gonna want to let them dry. Follow instructions again for letting the epoxy dry, but I usually let them sit for a day and come back the next day and continue with the next step. And that's it for this part. For the next step, this is not absolutely necessary, but I like to add a single layer of clear epoxy around the junction of the small PVC pipe to the big PVC cap, just to cover up if there are any holes. Like I said, they should have already been filled up with the glue or the epoxy that we placed on the inside, but I like to double check, and it gives a nice clean finished look. We use the same epoxy that we did when we used on the inside, and we'll just put a nice layer.
Shining through, till the sun comes shining through your little window, far above the traffic noise and city gloom.
And once it's placed, you do the same as before. You let the epoxy sit flat. Make sure your cap is flat, otherwise it'll spill off the side, and you let it sit. I typically let it sit for a day and come back and do more later.
You must do.
For this step, we're going to be soldering our wires from our pressure sensor that is potted in the PVC caps to the Dean's plug that we have previously soldered to the wires that connect to the feather boards. For this step, you're going to need the two separate electronic components. You need your feather boards with wires and your pressure sensor with wires. You also need a vise, soldering iron, soldering wire, wire cutter, wire stripper, and you also need your shrink wraps that you had saved previously when you soldered your Dean's plug to the wires of the feather board. Now, for this, you'll want to go ahead and braid your wires like I have here, similar to how you braided when you braided the wires of the feather board. You also want to go ahead and place your shrink wraps. You'll need one for each wire, like you did before when you soldered the other side of the Dean's plug. You want to make sure that these are pushed back. The heat from the soldering will cause them to shrink if they are too close. Then you'll want to make sure that all your wires are relatively the same length. Makes it easier when attaching to the Dean's plug. Trim them off. And you want to go ahead and strip the ends of the wires.
Your window, and you woke me with your loving hand, my news. March me down.
Once you have your wires stripped and you have your Dean's plug, you're ready to begin soldering them together. First, you'll want to pre-tin your wires. To do this, you're simply just adding some of the soldering wire to the ends of the wires you just stripped. And you'll add a little bit to each wire. After pre-tinning your wires, you'll want to switch to your Dean's plug. And you'll want to pre-tin 4 pins of your Dean's plug like you did before.
There's a golden ring where most men carry scars.
And then we'll begin soldering our wires to the Dean's plug. You want to make sure that the wires on this side of the Dean's plug perfectly match the color wires on the other side. You want your black first, red, white, then yellow. Make sure if you did them in a separate order, that's okay, as long as black is once again on that single pin by itself, and the other three, make sure that the wires on this side match the wires on the other side. So you'll solder the wires to the Dean's plug. Once your wires are attached, you want to make sure that they have good connections and no cross connections between the wires. Then you'll slide your shrink wraps up into place over the connections you just made. And lastly, apply heat to your shrink wraps, allowing them to shrink and cover those connections. And that's it for this step. Now you have a complete connection from your pressure sensor all the way to your feather boards, and they can be disconnected and reconnected whenever needed. And that's it for this step. For this step, we'll be attaching the PVC cap to the PVC pipe. You want to use your PVC cap, PVC pipe, and the PVC cement. You want to follow the instructions on the can, but what you will do is you're going to run your wire through the PVC pipe, and then you're going to be placing some of the cement on the inside of the cap and on the outside of the cap. First, I'll place them inside the cap. And second, around the pipe. And then you'll push the two together and turn as you push down. And it'll create a seal. And that's it for this step. And one final step, it isn't absolutely necessary, is to add some more clear epoxy around this edge where you have a connection between your pipe and your PVC cap. Very similar to the connection on the top of the PVC cap. We're doing it again on this side just to make sure we fill any gaps. This isn't absolutely necessary, but it is nice to know for sure that those gaps are covered. So you'll just place a light layer around the PVC pipe and cap. And this does have the tendency to spill over the side of the cap, so you want to make sure that when you set it to dry, set it on top of the table. You don't mind having a clear epoxy dry if it drips over, or on paper towel, something that will catch the drops of epoxy if they fall over the edge. And once we've made the loop around, again, set it aside, typically set it aside for a day, and then your gauge is complete. And that's the end of this step. So now we have completed the construction of our wave gauge. We have our electronic components with our feather boards and wires and pressure sensor, and we have our housing with our PVC pipes and caps all completed. Now we just all have to put them all together. There are a few things that you'll need. You'll need a battery. That's going to be the power source for your feather board and your wave gauge. And we have 3D printed an insert that holds our battery and our feather boards in place, allowing them to stay in place and be easier to pull out of the PVC pipe. If you don't have access to a 3D printer, you can always use something like a ruler or anything that you can that will help you to hold these in place and easier to pull out. If not, you can always place them in there, but there is a possibility that they jostled around and won't stay in place. So we use Velcro strap to temporarily hold our feather boards in place. That way we can always take them off if we need to. We can access the SD card and the charging ports, but we permanently secure our battery to the insert because we won't need to move that around unless it goes bad, and then we'll just fully replace it. So we'll use our Dean's plug to attach the wires from our feather boards to the wires that connect to our pressure sensor, and we can slide this into the PVC pipe. There is one more nice thing to have inside the PVC pipe, and that is desiccant that will soak up any moisture that happens to get inside, just in case, an extra layer of protection for your electronics. And with everything in, there are a few more things you'll need. We have a PVC cap that we like to place on this end of the wave gauge. We have small holes allowing water to reach the inside of this pipe, which holds the pressure sensor. That way it's still getting pressure, but we can keep out critters like crabs or snails that might mess up the pressure sensor, and it keeps that pressure sensor cleaner, allowing it to last longer, as long as you remove the cap and clean out the inside and don't let sediment dry inside of it. And one last thing is our red gripper cap that we place on the other end. This allows you to access the inside of the wave gauge, but when it goes into water, you can tighten it, and it creates a secure hold that will keep the water out. And that is the complete wave gauge.